There's something about the way in which we deal with lessons learned, and we don't recognise actually there's a huge investment that goes into our organisation's learning stuff. And yet we treat it as though it comes for free and it's there forever and we don't have to worry about it because we can always tap into these learnings. And I guess I want to take us through a bit of a journey and do some work together around understanding some of the truths and myths, perhaps, about lessons learned, whether it's a nuclear reactor or a drilling platform or a car that gets recalled. Everyone's talking about learning the lessons from these things. But what are these lessons and what do they look like? Because I'm suspicious that lessons learned are kind of the Higgs boson particle of knowledge management, that we know they have to exist because everybody talks about them, but nobody can ever really put their finger on them. You see glimpses of them going by here and there. There is a danger for us, I would say, in terms of if our knowledge strategies say nothing about learning, is there a danger, perhaps, I would venture to suggest, that actually we have a social media strategy or a content management strategy? And maybe we're in danger of lacking something distinctive and holistic and that ties right back to the things our organisations do that create value that we need to learn from. We need to prevent ourselves repeating failures. We need to ensure we can repeat successes. And often our KM strategies don't pay attention to that. Because social media is fantastic. I'm a big user of it, but it's not going to help a team to sit down and have a conversation and reflect on something they've just done or not done. So let's look at this, I guess, some of the myths and truths, some of the risks and the half-truths that we tell, perhaps, around knowledge management and around lessons learned particularly. See, one of the challenges we have is that knowledge transfer is a tremendously leaky process. From the minute, let's work in teams and projects from it. From the minute a project team has finished their project, the knowledge and insight and precious, precious things that they've earned during that project, individually and collectively for the organisation, begin to leak out. They just do, because project teams get disbanded, people go off onto the next latest and greatest thing, and then we begin to post-rationalise things and make our own version of the truth up. And we just forget things, as I'm finding now as I approach my mid-40s. That's just stuff goes. And yeah, it's hard to believe in our mid-40s. Yeah. And so how can we stem the flow of lessons in our organisation? What can we do? Because there is this moment that they begin to leak out. So what do we do at the end of a project? Well, of course, we get the project team together and we have some kind of a lessons learned review. We have a meeting, we have a conversation, and we sit down and we ask them questions. And we have to guess at what the right questions are that we need to ask them, such that the next team can pick up the questions that we thought were the right questions and hope that they'll match the problems that they have. And often, that's our process. Our process is all about trying to help a team or challenging a team to figure out what they thought their lessons were so that they can be made available for some imaginary team in the future. And I've never seen that work very well. What does work well is where you can connect directly the supply and the demand. And that's why techniques like baton passing, techniques like peer assists, any technique that brings together supply and demand of knowledge around a conversation in a culture of honesty and trust is a far more effective way than trying to challenge a team to figure out what their lessons were and then do something to capture those lessons. Because we can never know what the right questions are. And you can't ask a document a question later on. You can ask a person a question and interact with that. So there's a limit to what we can do if we have to figure out what the questions are for ourselves. So we lose more knowledge because we never ask ourselves the right questions, because there are things we take for granted. There are rules of thumb and assumptions that we make as professionals that we would never know we did unless somebody said, hang on a minute, how did you get from A to C? I missed that middle bit. And then when we're asked to think about it, it helps us figure out there's actually a B step that we would never have written down and we would never have even asked ourselves the question about. So there's something about the questions. So what do we do after our questions? We've had our project review, and some poor soul has written up lots of flip charts, and we end up with a document. If we've done it in the baton passing peer assist way, the people with the need have gone away with a list of actions and contacts and connections, and that's good news. But all too often we end up with a meeting and a bunch of flip charts. And we kind of say sometimes, well, we've captured the knowledge from that project. And my sense is that when we capture knowledge as information, which is what it is, when we capture it, it becomes information, we kill it. Now, dead butterflies still look nice, and you can still study them and you can still learn a lot about them, but they're not half as engaging as the ones that are still alive. And when we capture knowledge, when we write it down, however we choose to do that, we are taking the life out of it. So what can we do as knowledge professionals to try and put life back into that knowledge? How can we rehumanize the things that we capture? So when we do have documented insights, lessons, suggestions, recommendations, actions that come out of a really rich learning experience, let's make sure that we include links back to the people who learnt the lesson. We include as much of the body language, tone of voice, everything else we can tap into. So using a rich set of media such that we try and retain some of that extra context, but recognise it's a lossy process. It's a salvage exercise. When we write stuff down, we're trying to write down stuff, not that someone will take this as totality and act upon it, but that it's an advertisement for a conversation that I now need to have with this person who I can see, I can hear, I can spot the name, there's follow-up information, I know what they were about, I know what role they played in the project, I can see a picture of them. Do you know what I mean? We're trying to bring back the connection between the knowledge or the information that's come from that and the person, the source from whom it came, such that I can go back to the source rather than relying on some pale imitation, some dead butterfly collection that we often focus on, even though they look great. And even though they're easy things to sell to senior management teams and they're easy things to justify SharePoint investments for, they don't tell the whole story. So just beware, I would say, of creating too many dead butterfly collections, great though they look. So we have our knowledge captured in some system. The next thing we do is to put it somewhere. And that's another challenge, because sometimes we believe that by storing it somewhere, it's the same as sharing it. And it's not. It's just not hiding it. And often in our organisations, putting a lesson learned or a really rich document somewhere into the information architecture is pretty much as well as putting a needle into a haystack, because they are hard to find. And that's if people have the will to go and search for them. So often our information architecture, when we've got this far through the learning process, still doesn't help us, because we have that awful folder called lessons learned that we expect someone to find and figure out and make some sense of and look at and figure out what difference they can make to their project. It's a big ask, I would say. So kind of storage often doesn't help our problem. But even if we can get through all of that, for me the biggest missing piece of this whole closing the learning loop challenge we have is an absence of curiosity. Because I can have the most wonderful, richly designed way of displaying and capturing and codifying the knowledge that's come out. I can retain all of the links to individuals and sources. I can include multimedia and connections. And I can structure it and consolidate it around the topics that matter rather than just generic lessons learned. I can have lessons around these kind of small projects. Lessons come from negotiation. So I can do lots to structure it. But if no one's curious enough to go and figure out and find out what's there, then it is a wasted effort. There is something about recognising how do we create the demand for these things rather than just focusing our knowledge management efforts on making the supply effective. Thomas Friedman wrote the book, I think in about 2006, called The Flat World. And he wrote in there a little equation. I'll read you a quote from Thomas. I think it's a nice quote. Thomas Friedman, he said, so the flat Earth is about, flat world rather, is about globalization and its impact. It seems pretty normal now, doesn't it? We've kind of absorbed what that means to a degree. It doesn't seem shocking anymore. It's just, that's the world we're living in. But in 2005, when Thomas wrote his book, he wrote this way. He said, I have concluded that in a flat world, intelligence quotient still matters, but CQ and PQ matter more. That's curiosity quotient and passion quotient. He said, I live by the equation CQ plus PQ is greater than IQ. Give me a kid with a passion to learn and a curiosity to discover, and I will take him or her over a less passionate kid with a high IQ every day of the week. And I think that's quite an interesting challenge, because quite often, if we look hard at the way in which, as organisations, we attract and recruit and interview and retain our people, perhaps there's a danger that we focus a little more over here and a little less over here. I don't know. But I think it's a great challenge.